The British colonization of the Americas is a story that stretches across centuries, encompassing a vast array of experiences, events, and transformations that have had a lasting impact on the world. It is a tale of ambition, resilience, conflict, and change, as England, later joined by Scotland and eventually forming Great Britain, embarked on a journey to establish a foothold in the New World. This endeavor, which began in the late 16th century, was driven by a complex mix of motivations, including economic gain, religious freedom, national pride, and the desire for new opportunities. The initial attempts at colonization were driven by the promise of wealth and resources that the New World seemed to offer. The European powers, including Spain, Portugal, and France, had already begun to explore and claim territories in the Americas, and England was eager to join the race. The late 16th century saw the first English expeditions across the Atlantic, fueled by tales of gold, fertile land, and untapped resources. However, these early efforts met with limited success. One of the most notable early attempts was the Roanoke colony, established in 1585 on Roanoke Island, in what is now North Carolina. Sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh, the Roanoke colony was intended to be a permanent English settlement, but it faced numerous challenges from the outset. The settlers struggled with a lack of supplies, harsh environmental conditions, and tensions with the local Native American tribes. By 1590, when a supply ship arrived from England, the colony had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind little more than the cryptic word Croton carved into a tree. The fate of the lost colony remains one of the great mysteries of American history. Despite these early failures, the dream of colonization did not die. Instead, it evolved, with subsequent ventures becoming more organized and better funded. The English crown, along with private investors, began to see the potential for long-term settlements that could serve as sources of wealth and power. The focus shifted from mere exploration to the establishment of sustainable communities that could produce valuable commodities like tobacco, sugar, and cotton. The turning point in British colonization came in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia. This settlement, named in honor of King James I, was the first permanent English colony in the Americas. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company, financed the expedition, which was intended to establish a profitable colony that could produce goods for export back to England. The early years of Jamestown were marked by hardship and struggle. The settlers, many of whom were ill-prepared for the challenges of life in the New World, faced numerous difficulties, including food shortages, disease, and conflicts with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy. The starving time during the winter of 1609 to 1610 was particularly brutal, with only 60 of the original 214 colonists surviving. However, the colony managed to endure, thanks in part to the leadership of Captain John Smith and the eventual arrival of additional supplies and settlers. One of the key developments that helped ensure the survival of Jamestown was the introduction of tobacco cultivation. John Rolfe, a colonist who arrived in 1610, began experimenting with tobacco seeds from the West Indies. His efforts were successful, and tobacco quickly became the colony's cash crop, fueling its growth and prosperity. The demand for tobacco in Europe was high, and it provided the financial foundation that allowed Jamestown to thrive. The colonization of the Americas by the British was not a story of empty lands being settled by Europeans. The continents were already home to a vast array of indigenous peoples, each with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. The arrival of British settlers brought about significant changes for these Native American populations, often with devastating consequences. In the early years of colonization, interactions between the British settlers and indigenous peoples were marked by a mix of cooperation, conflict, and misunderstanding. In some cases, the settlers relied on Native Americans for survival, learning from them how to cultivate crops, hunt, and navigate the unfamiliar landscape. However, these relationships were often fragile and strained by the settlers' demands for land and resources. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, played a central role in the early history of Jamestown. Initially, there were efforts to establish peaceful relations, including the famous story of Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, who is said to have saved John Smith's life and later married John Rolfe. However, as the colony expanded, tensions grew, leading to a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. These wars were marked by violence and betrayal on both sides, culminating in the near destruction of the Powhatan Confederacy. The impact of British colonization on indigenous populations was profound and far-reaching. European diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, decimated entire communities. The settlers' insatiable demand for land led to the displacement of indigenous peoples, pushing them further west or into conflict. In many cases, traditional ways of life were disrupted, and cultures were irreversibly altered. As Jamestown took root and prospered, the British colonization of the Americas entered a new phase of expansion. Over the next several centuries, the British established colonies across North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America. Each colony had its own unique characteristics, shaped by geography, climate, and the particular motivations of its settlers. In North America, the 13 original colonies that would later become the United States were established along the eastern seaboard. These colonies included Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony developed its own economy, social structure, and governance, influenced by factors such as religion, available resources, and relationships with indigenous peoples. The New England colonies, for example, were largely settled by Puritans seeking religious freedom. The harsh climate and rocky soil made large-scale agriculture difficult, so the economy in this region was based on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. In contrast, the southern colonies, with their warmer climate and fertile land, developed economies based on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. This agricultural economy relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans, who were forcibly brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. The British Caribbean colonies, including Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas, were also highly profitable thanks to the cultivation of sugarcane. The sugar plantations in these colonies were brutal environments, where enslaved Africans were forced to work under grueling conditions. The wealth generated by the sugar trade made the Caribbean colonies some of the most valuable in the British Empire, but it came at a tremendous human cost. In addition to these well-known regions, the British also established colonies in Central and South America. British Honduras, now Belize, and the Mosquito Coast, in present-day Nicaragua and Honduras, were part of the British sphere of influence in Central America. In South America, the British briefly held territory in what is now Guyana. These colonies, though less prominent than those in North America and the Caribbean, played a role in the broader British strategy of expanding its global reach. As the British colonies in the Americas grew in size and economic importance, tensions began to emerge between the colonies and the British government. These tensions were rooted in issues of governance, taxation, and representation. The British government, seeking to exert greater control over its colonies and recoup the costs of defending them, imposed a series of taxes and regulations that were deeply unpopular among the colonists. The most famous of these measures was the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper from London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. The act was seen as a direct attempt to raise revenue from the colonies without their consent, leading to widespread protests and the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but it set the stage for further conflict. The Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on imported goods, and the Tea Act of 1773, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, further inflamed tensions. These acts led to acts of resistance, such as the Boston Tea Party, where colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor. The growing unrest culminated in the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. The colonies, united in their desire for independence, fought a long and difficult war against the British Empire. The war ended in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the independence of the United States of America. The success of the American Revolution had a profound impact on the British Empire and its remaining colonies. It inspired independence movements across the Americas, leading to the eventual decolonization of most British territories in the region. However, not all colonies sought independence. Some, such as Canada and the British Caribbean islands, remained under British rule, though with varying degrees of autonomy. While the majority of British colonies in the Americas eventually gained independence, some regions chose to remain under British jurisdiction as British overseas territories. These territories, which include Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, the Falkland Islands, and others, have unique relationships with the United Kingdom. British overseas territories are not part of the United Kingdom itself, but they are under its sovereignty. They have their own local governments and operate with a high degree of autonomy, but they rely on the UK for defense and international representation. The residents of these territories are British citizens, and they participate in the UK's political processes, though their representation is limited compared to that of citizens in the UK proper. These territories are remnants of the once vast British Empire, and they continue to play a role in the UK's global presence. They are often strategically important locations, such as the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, which were the focus of a conflict between the UK and Argentina in 1982. The British government's commitment to these territories reflects the enduring legacy of its colonial past and the complex web of historical, political, and cultural ties that continue to bind these regions to the UK. The legacy of British colonization in the Americas is multifaceted and complex. On one hand, it brought about significant economic development, the spread of European culture, and the establishment of political institutions that have shaped the modern world. The United States, for example, was founded on principles of democracy and individual rights that can be traced back to the political ideas brought over by British colonists. On the other hand, colonization also led to the displacement and destruction of indigenous cultures, the exploitation and enslavement of millions of people, and the imposition of foreign rule on diverse populations. The consequences of these actions continue to be felt today, as former colonies grapple with the legacies of colonialism, including economic inequality, racial and ethnic tensions, and ongoing struggles for political and cultural autonomy. In the Americas, the impact of British colonization is evident in the cultural, linguistic, and political landscapes of the region. English is the dominant language in many former British colonies, and British legal and political systems have influenced the governance of these nations. However, the process of decolonization and the assertion of national identities have also led to the development of unique cultures that blend indigenous, African, European, and other influences. The history of British colonization in the Americas is a story of human endeavor on a grand scale, marked by both triumphs and tragedies. It is a history that continues to resonate in the present, shaping the identities and destinies of the people and nations of the Americas. As we reflect on this history, it is important to recognize both the achievements and the costs of colonization, and to understand how the past continues to influence the world we live in today. The British colonization of the Americas was a monumental undertaking that had far-reaching consequences for both the colonizers and the colonized. It was a process driven by a complex mix of motivations, including the pursuit of wealth, the desire for new opportunities, and the spread of European culture and religion. The establishment of colonies in the Americas led to the development of new societies, the displacement of indigenous peoples, and the creation of systems of exploitation and inequality that have left a lasting legacy. Today, the impact of British colonization can be seen in the languages, cultures, and political systems of the Americas. The process of decolonization and the ongoing struggles for justice and equality are reminders of the deep and enduring effects of this period in history. As we continue to study and understand the history of British colonization, we gain valuable insights into the forces that have shaped our world and the challenges that lie ahead. The story of British colonization is not just a tale of the past. It is a living history that continues to influence the present and future of the Americas and the world at large. Through this lens, we can better appreciate the complexities of history and the ways in which the past shapes our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.